Draupadi hated dockside Panchal 24. The stench of ink and parchment rode over the tangy brine of the sea and seeped into the cracked window panes of smoke-filled houses. Streets throbbed like veins of corruption and despair, dark business flickering in the rivulets beneath stolen electricity. There was always misery to be extracted in Panchal 24, like an ore to be mined. Hey everyone, I'm Amanda and this is A to Z Books, where I talk about everything from books to writing. Those were the opening lines to the space opera story Floating on the Stream That Brings from the Fount by Prashanth Srivatsa. It came out in the 2023 January-February edition of the Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. In this world, space travel is driven by fuel created by an engine with a capital E. And in order for this engine to create fuel, it has to be fed. And what it feeds on are stories. The galaxy is run by an overarching government called the Empire. And within this government, there are various warring factions. There are dynasties run by families, and they own planets, and they're trying to get out from under the thumb of the Empire. And the Empire is losing power. How is it losing power? Well, the Empire actually runs the engine itself. And in order to feed the engine, they basically have enslaved writers to write creative, unique stories for the engine, because that is what it prefers to feed on. And what happens is, as they are driving these writers to the bone, they're producing less output, they're producing lesser quality output, and so the engine is not producing as much fuel, and the Empire is running out of that fuel, which means that their power is in jeopardy. Another interesting aspect to the engine is it appears to evolve. So it seems that the engine is becoming hungrier for more stories and becoming more insatiable, which makes it even more difficult to be able to feed it to get the fuel. Here's another really great quote. There was a time once, she imagined, when any association with the Empire would have been sufficient to send the dynasties scattering out of their way like roaches. When the engine was hail, writers were heroes, and words were gods whose mythical stories melted within the bones of the engine in a denouement of thermodynamics. Isn't that gorgeous? So when we enter the story, we find out that there's a rumor of a Earth library, so a library filled with books from the original Earth, and these would all be stories that the engine has not seen yet. So the Empire has heard about this, and they are desperate to get their hands on these books to feed the engine and maintain their power. So they have tasked a small secret group of people with finding this library and bringing the books back to the engine. And it is supposed to be a very covert mission, because if the other dynasties find out about this library, they might try to find it and seize it for themselves, which would give them a lot of power. So the story is told from the point of view of an imperial captain named Draupadi. She has recruited various people to come with her on this mission, and the imperial government has also chosen some of the people to go on the mission as well. One aspect of the story that I think I found very interesting is that it references an Indian epic poem called the Mahabharata. Now, if you haven't heard of the Mahabharata, it's, like I said, an ancient epic poem, similar to the Odyssey, except it's much bigger than the Odyssey by like 4x. Before reading this particular story, I wasn't very familiar with the Mahabharata, except that I did read the Bhagavad Gita in college, and the Bhagavad Gita is just one small section of the Mahabharata. In a very broad sense, what the Mahabharata is about is it's the story of two warring parts of a family. They're trying to get power. There's a huge epic battle, and throughout we have stories about various members in each family, and these characters also interact with various Hindu gods, similar to how in the Odyssey many of the characters interact with the Greek gods. Draupadi, if you remember, is the name of the imperial captain, is also the name of one of the major characters in the Mahabharata. So she is the wife of 5 brothers, and she is born out of this sacrifice of fire. And there are several things that happen to her throughout the epic poem. One of these is that her husband decides to put her up as a stake in a card gambling game. Not a good idea. And she's humiliated, and she has to be rescued by one of the major Hindu gods named Krishna. So I was able to pick up on several references to the Mahabharata in this story. I will admit that at first I definitely didn't realize that there are references to the Mahabharata. At the beginning of the story, there's a very short biography of the author where he mentions that the story comes from his interest in space operas and the Mahabharata. So when I went back to read it a second time, I was much more easily able to pick up on some of these tie-ins that he has. The most obvious references were obvious because they took me out of the story just a little bit. There are several references from Draupadi, who is the narrator, about how she has spoken in the past to this character called the Sage. We don't know who the Sage is, but they have, it seems, said these prophecies about her, and she's not sure what they mean yet, but she has several of these flashbacks throughout the story, and until the end it's not really clear about how these might affect the overall plot that's going on with them trying to find the library. There are a few things that the Sage says that very obviously are referencing the epic poem. He talks about Draupadi as being born of fire. Like I mentioned before, the Draupadi in the Mahabharata was born out of a fire sacrifice, so that's a very obvious parallel. And there's also a character in the short story that wears a peacock feather on their head at one point. And if you remember, I said that Krishna in the Mahabharata saves Draupadi from humiliation during the card game. And Krishna in art is often portrayed as wearing a peacock feather on their head. So that's another very obvious tie-in. But back to the story. Most of it, probably the first 75%, is taken up by Draupadi recruiting people to her team and their several month-long travel through space to get to the area where the library is supposed to be. And over the course of their travel, you find out a little bit more about the background of each character and what their motivations are for finding the library and how they feel about the Empire in general. So maybe the last 25% occurs when they actually land on the planet where the library is supposed to be. I'm not going to talk any more about it in case you decide to read it, and I don't want to spoil it. But by the end, the connection to the Mahabharata is made much more explicit. All of this is to say that Floating on the Stream is an amazing story. It's this rich world building, space opera backgrounds that I wish I could have a little bit more of. The concept of an engine that feeds on stories is so unique to me. As with most novelettes, it felt like it ended a little bit too soon. But it is a fully complete story within itself. It's very satisfying to read. It's 40 pages. Novelettes are often very short like that. So if you don't have a lot of time, it's, you can read it in 30 minutes, maybe an hour tops, which is the great thing about shorter stories like this. And Prashanth Srivatsa is putting out his debut novel, The Spice Gate, later this year, which I'll definitely be picking up. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe below, and I'll see you next time.